You think rank is something you can read off a sleeve? The laughter came fast, sharp, and a little too loud for the cramped GP tent, cutting through the steady hum of generators outside and the low murmur of Marines moving between folding tables and gear racks. Corporal Lucas Reed stood with his arms crossed, a grin stretched across his face like he had just found the easiest target of the day. In front of him sat an old man on a worn metal chair, still as stone, hands resting loosely on his knees, his clothes plain, faded, out of place among the crisp digital camo and polished boots. Reed tilted his head, looking him up and down like an inspection already failed. "I'm talking to you, old-timer," he said, louder this time, making sure the others nearby could hear. A couple of younger Marines glanced over, smirking, sensing entertainment. The old man didn't answer, didn't even blink. His eyes, pale, steady, were fixed somewhere past Reed, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. Reed let out a short chuckle and took a step closer, boots scraping lightly against the packed dirt floor. "You lost, sir? This area's restricted. Not exactly a place for civilians to wander into." The word civilians hung in the air, deliberate, dismissive, a subtle push meant to provoke. Still nothing. The old man remained quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't shrink under pressure. It just existed, solid, unmoved. Reed's smile tightened just a fraction, not liking the lack of reaction around them. The tent carried on, radios crackling, canvas shifting with the wind, the distant thump of rotor blades somewhere beyond the perimeter. But inside this small circle, the air began to feel heavier. Reed shifted his weight, glancing back at his buddies as if to confirm the moment was still his. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once, sharp, performative. "Let's make this simple." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but still loud enough for others to catch. "You got ID? Orders? Anything that says you belong here?" The old man slowly turned his head, just enough to look at him now, really look at him, and for a split second, something in that gaze made Reed hesitate. Not fear, not exactly, just wait, like standing too close to the edge of something deep without realizing it. Reed pushed past it, scoffing under his breath. "Yeah, didn't think so." He straightened, rolling his shoulders, slipping back into that easy confidence. "Here's how this works," he continued, gesturing casually toward the tent entrance. "You get up, you walk out, and nobody has to make a big deal out of it." A pause, then a smirk. "Or we can keep going, and trust me, that won't end the way you want." A few heads turned now, conversations fading just slightly, the shift subtle but real. The old man's gaze didn't waver, didn't harden, didn't soften. It just stayed there, steady as ever. Reed exhaled through his nose, impatience creeping in. "You even remember what your rank was?" he asked, this time with a sharper edge, the kind of question meant to corner, to reduce, to remind someone of where they stood, or didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It stretched, slow and deliberate, filling the space between them, pressing against the canvas walls, settling over the Marines, who had begun to notice that something about this exchange didn't feel right anymore. Reed waited, expecting hesitation, confusion, maybe even embarrassment, but the old man didn't look away, didn't shift in his seat, didn't rush to answer. He just sat there, calm, like time moved differently around him. And for the first time since he opened his mouth, Corporal Lucas Reed felt the faintest crack in his control, like the moment wasn't his anymore, even if he didn't understand why. Reed let out a slow breath, forcing a smirk back onto his face as if nothing had shifted, as if that strange weight in the air was just in his head. "Yeah," he said, nodding once, louder now, reclaiming the space. "That is what I thought." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the Marines nearby. Guy does not even remember his own rank. A few chuckles followed, thinner this time, uncertain, not as confident as before. But Reed leaned into it, feeding off what little reaction he could pull. He stepped closer again, just inside the old man's space. "Let me make this easier for you," he said, his tone sharpening. "You give me a name, a unit, something real, or I call this in and we let military police sort it out." The words were clean, procedural, but there was a challenge underneath them now, an edge that had not been there before. The old man's eyes followed him calmly, tracking every movement without hurry, without tension, like he had seen this kind of moment play out 100 different ways and already knew how it would end. Reed felt it again, that quiet resistance, not defiance, not fear, just something immovable, and it irritated him more than open disrespect ever could. "You think this is a joke?" Reed pressed, his voice dropping lower, tighter. "Because I do not." He paused, waiting, expecting something this time. Anything, but the silence held, stretching longer than it should have, drawing more attention from the edges of the tent, conversation slowing, a radio call going unanswered for a second too long. Reed reached out then, almost without thinking, his eyes catching on something small against the old man's jacket, a piece of metal, dull, warped, pinned slightly off-center like it did not belong there and yet had never been moved. "What is this supposed to be?" Reed asked, his tone shifting into something closer to mockery again, safer ground. He tapped it lightly with his finger, the metal giving a faint, dry click against the fabric. "This your badge of honor?" A couple of Marines leaned in just enough to see, their curiosity outweighing their earlier amusement. The object was strange, not polished, not official, no recognizable insignia, just a rough fragment, scorched at the edges, shaped by something that had not been gentle. Reed smirked, shaking his head. "You picked that up at a flea market or something," he said, flicking it once more, but the old man's hand moved then, not fast, not aggressive, just steady, closing over the piece of metal with a quiet certainty, stopping the motion without force. Reed froze for a fraction of a second, not because of the movement itself, but because of how precise it was, how controlled, like it had been done the same exact way a long time ago for a very different reason. The old man looked down briefly at the object in his hand, and for just an instant, something shifted in his expression, not visible enough for most to notice, but Reed saw it. A flicker, not anger, not pain, something deeper, something older. Then it was gone, replaced by that same calm stillness. Across the tent, Staff Sergeant Daniel Ortiz had been watching from near a supply table. Arms folded, his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp. He had seen the whole exchange from the beginning, had felt the tone change long before the others did, and now his eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on the old man in a way that was no longer casual. Something about the way he held himself, the way he had not reacted, the way he had stopped Reed's hand without escalating the situation. It did not match the picture Reed was trying to paint. Ortiz shifted his weight, glancing once toward the entrance of the tent, then back again, his instincts quiet but persistent, telling him there was more here than anyone had said out loud. Reed cleared his throat, trying to shake off the moment, pulling his hand back and straightening, his voice louder again, sharper. "I asked you a question," he said, each word landing harder than before. "What was your rank?" This time there was no laughter, no easy reaction, just the low hum of the tent and the faint rustle of canvas overhead as everyone within earshot waited, not because they cared about the answer, but because something in the way the question was asked made it feel like they should. The question did not echo this time. It settled, heavy and deliberate, as if the entire tent had leaned in without realizing it. Corporal Lucas Reed held his ground, chin slightly raised, waiting for the answer he was certain would either confirm his authority or expose the old man as exactly what he believed him to be, someone who did not belong, someone who had wandered too far into a place that was not his anymore. The old man did not respond right away. He simply looked at Reed, not with challenge, not with submission, but with a quiet patience that made the seconds stretch longer than they should have. The faint hum of the generator outside seemed louder now, the canvas above them shifting with a slow breath of wind. Somewhere a metal tool clinked against a table and then stopped, like even the background noise was beginning to fall into line with the moment. Reed felt it again, that subtle loss of control, like the conversation had slipped just out of his grasp, and he tightened his jaw. "I am not asking again," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "What was your rank?" The old man's gaze did not waver, but something in his posture changed, not visibly, not enough for most to notice, but it was there, a slight straightening of his back, a quiet alignment, like a memory settling into place rather than rising to the surface. His hand still rested over the small piece of metal on his jacket, fingers lightly curved around it, not protective, just present. When he finally spoke, His voice was low, steady, and carried farther than it should have in a space like this. "You are asking the wrong question," he said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything louder could have. Reed blinked, thrown off just enough to hesitate. "No," Reed replied quickly, pushing forward. "I am asking a very simple question." He gestured around them. "To the uniforms, the structure, the order of the place. Everyone here has a rank. That is how this works." The old man's eyes moved briefly, not away, but past Reed, taking in the Marines, the tables, the tent itself, as if he were seeing it all from a distance no one else could measure. "That is how it works now," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just a statement that carried a weight Reed could not immediately define. A few of the Marines shifted where they stood, exchanging glances they did not fully understand. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ortiz felt a tightening in his chest, a recognition that had not yet formed into a clear thought, but was getting closer with every word. Reed exhaled sharply, a short, frustrated breath. "So you were saying you did not have one?" he pressed, seizing on what he thought was an opening. "That you were not even in?" The old man looked back at him fully now, and for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something behind his eyes, not emotion in the usual sense, but depth, like looking through a window into something much larger than the room they stood in. "I am saying," he replied, his voice even, unhurried, "that rank was never the thing that mattered where I stood." The words settled into the space, not loud, not dramatic, but impossible to ignore. Reed opened his mouth to respond, to push back, to reassert the structure he understood, but the words did not come as easily this time, because somewhere in the back of his mind, something did not line up anymore. Something about the way this man spoke, the way he carried himself, the way he had not once tried to defend or explain himself. It did not match the idea Reed had already decided was true, and that uncertainty, small as it was, began to spread, just enough to make the moment feel different, just enough to make the next answer matter more than it should have. Reed felt the shift before he could name it, like the ground under a steady stance had tilted just enough to throw off balance, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to call it out, but enough that his next words came a fraction slower than before. "That does not make any sense," he said, forcing a short laugh that did not carry the same confidence it had a minute ago. "Everyone has a rank. That is the whole point of the structure." He gestured again, broader this time, pulling the tent, the Marines, the system itself into his argument as if that would anchor it, but the old man did not react to the gesture, did not follow it. His eyes stayed where they were, calm, steady, unshaken. "Structure changes," the old man said quietly, and there was something in the way he said it that did not challenge Reed. It simply existed, like a fact that did not need agreement to remain true. Reed shook his head, stepping back half a pace, creating just enough distance to feel like he was regaining control. "No," he said, sharper now. "It does not change like that. Not here." His voice carried farther again, pulling more attention. A few Marines at the edge of the tent had stopped what they were doing entirely now, their focus drawn in without knowing why. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ortiz shifted again, this time taking a step closer, slow, deliberate, not interrupting, but positioning himself where he could hear every word clearly. His eyes moved from Reed to the old man and back, reading something in the space between them that Reed still refused to see. Reed pointed once more, this time directly at the old man's chest, at the small, warped piece of metal still held under his hand. "And whatever that is," he added, his tone edging back toward mockery, but thinner now, less certain, "that is not a rank either." The old man's gaze dropped briefly to the object, his fingers adjusting slightly, not to hide it, not to display it, just to feel it, as if confirming it was still there. When he looked back up, his expression had not changed, but the air around him seemed to settle even further, quieter, heavier. "No," he said. "It is not." Reed exhaled, a quick breath through his nose, seizing on the response like it was something solid again. "Good," he replied, nodding. "Once, so we agree." He took another step, closing the distance he had just created, trying to press the moment back into something he understood. "So I will ask you one last time." His voice lowered, controlled, but there was a strain in it now, something tighter. "What was your rank?" The question hung there again, But this time it felt different, not like a challenge, not like a test. More like a line that once crossed could not be stepped back from. The old man did not answer immediately. He looked at Reed, really looked at him, and for a brief second, something passed between them that Reed could not explain, not a threat, not a warning, just an awareness, as if the old man understood exactly who Reed was in this moment and exactly who he might become after it. Then the old man's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but past Reed again, toward the open edge of the tent where light filtered in, pale and steady, dust moving through it in slow drifting lines. "If I answer you," he said, his voice low, even, "it will not give you what you think it will." The words did not rise, did not fall. They settled, deliberate and final. Reed's jaw tightened, his patience thinning. "That is not your call to make." He shot back quickly, pushing forward again, because stopping now felt worse than pushing through. "You either answer the question or you leave." The ultimatum landed harder than anything he had said before, sharp, clear, unmistakable, and for a moment, the entire tent seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the line would break. The ultimatum did not shake him. It did not speed him up. It did not force a reaction the way Reed expected. Instead, the old man simply sat there, the same quiet presence, the same steady gaze, as if time itself had slowed around him while everything else continued to move at its normal pace. Reed felt the stillness press in again, heavier now, less avoidable, and it irritated him in a way he could not quite explain, because there was nothing to push against, no defiance to confront, no fear to control, just that calm, unyielding silence. "You heard me," Reed added, sharper this time, filling the space with his voice because the quiet was starting to work against him. "Answer or leave." The old man's hand shifted slightly over the piece of metal, his thumb brushing across its surface in a small, absent motion, like someone tracing a memory rather than holding an object. And for a brief moment, his eyes moved again, not toward Reed, not toward anyone in the tent, but somewhere far beyond it, somewhere that did not exist in the present. The hum of the generator seemed to fade, replaced by something else, something distant, the low, rhythmic pulse of rotor blades cutting through thick air, the faint crackle of a radio struggling to hold a signal, voices overlapping, urgent but controlled, then gone, just as quickly as it had come. The old man blinked once, the present settling back into place without disruption, without explanation. Reed frowned slightly, watching him, not understanding what had just shifted but feeling it all the same. "You are not even going to try," Reed pressed, his voice tightening again, but there was less certainty behind it now. "You walk in here, sit down, ignore orders, and you expect that to just be fine." The old man finally looked directly at him again, fully present, fully aware, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet weight as before. "I am already where I am supposed to be," he said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than Reed expected, not because of what it meant, but because of how certain it sounded, like there was no room for doubt in it at all. Reed let out a short, incredulous breath, shaking his head. "That is not how this works," he said, but even as he spoke, the words felt thinner, less grounded, as if the structure he kept pointing to was not holding the way it should. Across the tent, Staff Sergeant Daniel Ortiz's focus sharpened further. The fragments were beginning to align now, not fully, not enough to name, but enough to feel the shape of something bigger forming beneath the surface. He glanced briefly toward a nearby table where a tablet sat among scattered paperwork, then back at the old man, weighing something silently. Reed stepped forward again, closing the gap once more, his presence more forceful now, trying to reclaim what he had lost. "Last chance," he said, each word deliberate, final. "What was your rank?" The tent seemed to contract around the question, the air tightening, every small sound fading into the background. The old man held his gaze for a long moment, not challenging, not avoiding, just meeting it. And then, slowly, he shook his head, not in refusal, not in defiance, but in something closer to acknowledgment. "You are still asking the wrong question," he said quietly, and this time there was something else beneath it. Not emotion, not quite, but history, depth, something that reached far beyond the edges of the tent and the moment they were standing in. Reed's expression hardened, frustration finally breaking through. because he could feel it now. The shift he could not control, the attention that was no longer his, the moment that had slipped out of his hands. And he did the only thing he knew to do when that happened. He pushed harder, even as the ground beneath him continued to move in ways he did not yet understand. Reed stepped in closer than before, close enough that the space between them no longer felt neutral. It felt claimed, asserted, controlled. At least that was what he intended. But the old man did not lean back, did not shift, did not acknowledge the pressure in the way Reed expected, and that lack of reaction only sharpened the tension further. "You do not get to redefine the question," Reed said, his voice firm. But now there was a strain beneath it, something that had not been there at the beginning. "This is not a discussion. This is a direct order." The word order landed with weight, the kind that usually settled things, clarified positions, restored structure, but here it seemed to hang without anchoring. The old man's gaze held steady, absorbing the word without reacting to it, as if it belonged to a system he recognized but no longer answered to. Across the tent, the movement had slowed almost completely. Conversations had faded into silence. Marines who had been working moments ago now stood still, their attention pulled toward the center, without anyone needing to call it. Staff Sergeant Daniel Ortiz felt it fully now, not just a suspicion, not just a feeling, but a certainty forming. Something about this was wrong in a way that mattered. His eyes moved again to the nearby table, to the tablet resting among the paperwork, then back to the old man, and this time he made a decision, small, quiet, but deliberate. He turned slightly, reaching for the tablet without drawing attention, his movements controlled, practiced, the kind that blended into the background if no one was looking directly at him. Reed did not notice, his focus locked forward, pushing harder. "You are in a United States Marine Corps operational space," he continued, each word precise, structured. "You follow the chain of command or you leave." The old man listened, not passively, not dismissively, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgment, like he understood every word, every rule being cited, and still chose not to move, not out of defiance, but out of something else entirely, something Reed could not categorize. The old man's hand remained over the piece of metal, his thumb resting along its edge, and for a brief second, his eyes shifted again, not away, but inward, as if the present moment had brushed against something older, something buried deep beneath. Years of silence. The faint hum of the generator softened once more in his perception, replaced by a distant echo, a radio call sign cutting through static, clipped, urgent, then silence. A silence that carried meaning rather than absence. And just as quickly, the tent returned, the weight of the present settling back into place. The old man looked at Reed again, fully present, fully grounded, and when he spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "You are standing on a line you cannot see," he said, and the words were not a warning, not a threat. They were simply stated, like an observation Reed had not yet realized was true. Reed frowned, the statement catching him off guard. "What is that supposed to mean?" he demanded. But the question lacked the sharpness of his earlier ones, because somewhere beneath his certainty, something else had begun to take shape, something quieter, something less comfortable. Across the tent, Ortiz powered on the tablet, the screen lighting up softly in his hands. He angled it away from the others, his fingers moving quickly but carefully, pulling up internal records, searching, cross-referencing. Guided more by instinct than by clear information, his eyes flicked up once, watching the old man, then back down to the screen, the search narrowing. "Refining," Reed exhaled again, frustration rising. "You keep talking around it," he said, stepping even closer, pressing the moment to its edge. "It is a simple question." The old man met his gaze without hesitation, without resistance, and for a long second, neither of them moved. The space between them held tight, waiting, and somewhere just outside that moment, unseen by Reed, the first piece of truth was about to surface. Ortiz's thumb hovered for half a second above the screen before he tapped, the tablet responding instantly, lines of data loading in clean, structured blocks. But what caught his attention was not what appeared, it was what did not. Fields that should have been filled were blank, records that should have been accessible were restricted, and at the top of the screen, a small, unmistakable marker appeared, a classification tag that did not belong in a routine personnel search. Ortiz's expression tightened slightly, his posture still controlled, but his focus now absolute. He adjusted his grip on the tablet, angling it further away from the others, his eyes scanning faster, pulling at fragments, cross-referencing identifiers that did not quite align. Across the tent, Reed was still speaking, still pushing, but his words no longer carried the same weight. They filled the air without anchoring. "You are avoiding a direct question," Reed said, his voice firm but thinner now. "That tells me everything I need to know." The old man did not respond immediately. He simply watched him, that same steady gaze, and for the first time, Reed felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, subtle, quiet, and growing. Because nothing about this interaction had resolved the way it should have. Nothing had followed the pattern he understood. Ortiz's fingers moved again, deeper into the system now, bypassing standard filters, pulling archived layers that most would not think to access. And then it happened. Not a dramatic reveal, not a sudden flood of information, but a single line, simple, precise, and completely out of place. A name, not listed in standard format, not attached to rank, not categorized the way every other entry was. Just a name, followed by a designation that was not meant for general visibility. Ortiz's breath slowed, his eyes narrowing as he read it again, confirming, making sure it was not an error, not a mispull, but it held, unchanged, undeniable. He looked up then, slowly, his gaze locking onto the old man with a clarity that had not been there before. The pieces were no longer fragments. They had aligned, and what they formed did not fit inside the structure Reed was still trying to enforce. Reed stepped forward again, closing the space completely now, his presence firm, insistent. "This is over," he said, his voice carrying a finality he was trying to force into reality. "You either answer or you leave right now." The tent held its breath again. The moment stretched tight, waiting for the break. The old man met his gaze, unshaken, unchanged, and for a long second, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, the old man drew a breath, not rushed, not hesitant, just measured, deliberate. "If I answer you," he said, his voice low, steady, "you will stop talking." The words settled into the space, heavier than anything that had been said before, not because of volume, but because of certainty. Reed opened his mouth to respond, to push back, to reject the implication, but the words did not come immediately, because something in the way it was said did not feel like a challenge. It felt like a fact. Ortiz took a step forward then, subtle but decisive, his voice cutting in for the first time, controlled, respectful, but firm. "Corporal," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Reed pause without fully understanding why. Ortiz's eyes flicked briefly to Reed, then back to the old man, the weight of what he had just uncovered sitting clearly behind them. "You might want to reconsider how you are handling this," he added, and though the words were measured, they carried an authority that did not come from rank alone. Reed frowned, turning slightly toward Ortiz, irritation mixing with that growing uncertainty. "Staff Sergeant, I have it under control," he replied, but the statement lacked its earlier confidence, because for the first time since this began, he was no longer the only one defining the moment, and somewhere just beneath the surface, something much larger than his authority was beginning to take shape. Reed held Ortiz's gaze for a moment longer than he intended, long enough for the shift in the room to become undeniable. The attention was no longer centered on his authority. It had moved, subtly but completely, and he could feel it slipping through his grasp. "Reconsider what?" Reed asked, his voice still firm but edged now with something less certain. Ortiz did not answer immediately. He took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough to stand within the same space. The tablet still angled in his hand, its screen dim but active. "You are treating this like a routine situation," Ortiz said quietly, his tone controlled, measured, but carrying a weight Reed could not ignore. "It is not." The words landed differently than anything else that had been said, not loud, not confrontational, but anchored in something Reed had not yet seen. Reed frowned, glancing briefly at the tablet, then back at Ortiz, irritation rising again as a defense against the uncertainty building underneath. "Then explain it," Reed replied. Sharper now, pushing back against the shift. Because from where I am standing, this is exactly what it looks like. Ortiz's eyes flicked once more to the old man, then back to Reed. And in that brief glance, there was a clarity that had not been there before, a recognition that changed the way he held himself, the way he spoke. From where you are standing, Ortiz said. You are missing the part that matters. Reed's jaw tightened, the response landing just off center. Not something he could easily counter, not something he could dismiss outright. The tent remained silent around them. Every Marine within earshot now fully aware that whatever this was, it had moved beyond a simple exchange. The old man remained seated, unchanged, his presence steady, unaffected by the rising tension or the shifting dynamics around him. He did not look at Ortiz, did not acknowledge the shift directly, but there was a quiet awareness in the way. He held himself, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had already seen this moment long before it unfolded. Reed exhaled slowly, forcing himself back into the moment, back into control. No, he said, shaking his head once, grounding himself in the structure he knew. We are not doing this. He turned slightly back toward the old man, reclaiming the focus. You answer the question, or you leave. That is it. The old man met his gaze again, calm as ever, and for a brief second, something almost like understanding passed through his eyes. Not approval, not agreement, just a quiet acknowledgment of where Reed stood in this moment. Then he spoke, his voice steady, low, and carrying further than it should have. You are about to learn something you cannot unlearn, he said, and the words did not rise, did not fall. They settled into the space with a certainty that made the air feel heavier. Reed opened his mouth to respond, to push back, to reject the implication. But before he could, a new sound cut through the silence, sharp, distinct, and entirely out of place in the stillness that had settled over the tent. The distant but unmistakable approach of vehicles, engines moving with purpose, not routine, not casual. The Marines near the entrance turned instinctively, their attention pulled outward, the sound growing louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. Reed's focus broke for just a second, his eyes shifting toward the entrance, and in that brief moment, the control he had been holding on to slipped just enough for the reality outside to press in. Ortiz did not look surprised. He did not react with confusion or urgency. He simply watched, his expression steady. As if the next part of this had already been set in motion, the old man remained exactly where he was, unmoved, his hand still resting lightly over the small piece of metal, his gaze calm, patient, as if he had been waiting not for Reed's answer, but for something else entirely, something that was now arriving, just beyond the edge of the tent. The sound of the engines did not fade. It grew, steady and deliberate, rolling across the ground outside the tent with a purpose that cut through the last fragments of normal activity. Marines near the entrance straightened instinctively, their posture shifting before their minds fully caught up. The canvas flap moved with a sudden rush of air as shadows crossed it, dark shapes resolving into defined movement just beyond. Reed turned fully now, his focus pulled away despite himself. The moment he had been trying to control slipping completely from his hands. And then the flap opened, not violently, not abruptly, but with a controlled precision that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. A figure stepped in, followed by another, then another, uniforms crisp, presence unmistakable. The air inside the tent changed instantly, not louder, not chaotic, but sharper, like every detail had come into focus at once. Conversation stopped entirely. Marines who had been standing at ease snapped into attention without being told. The shift was automatic, immediate, absolute. Reed felt it before he processed it, his body reacting a fraction of a second before his mind caught up, his posture straightening, his shoulders tightening, his voice gone, replaced by the same silence that had been building since the beginning. Staff Sergeant Ortiz stepped back slightly, giving space, his role already complete, his eyes moving briefly toward Reed, then toward the old man. The connection between the two now fully clear. The senior officer at the front did not scan the room the way Reed had earlier, did not assert control through movement or words. He walked forward with a calm certainty, his path direct, his attention fixed, not on the Marines standing rigid around him, not on Reed, but on the old man still seated in the same place, unchanged, unmoved, as if none of this was unexpected. The officer stopped a few feet in front of him, the entire tent holding its breath, waiting for the exchange that would define everything that had come before it. Reed stood frozen now, caught between confusion and realization, his earlier certainty replaced by a growing awareness that he had been operating with only part of the picture. The officer did not speak immediately. He simply looked at the old man, and in that look there was no question, no doubt, only recognition. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a precise, controlled motion and saluted. The movement was clean, exact, carried out with a level of respect that left no room for interpretation. A ripple moved through the tent, silent but powerful, every Marine present feeling it at the same time. Reed's breath caught, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. The old man looked up at the officer, his expression unchanged, calm, steady, and after a brief pause, he returned the salute, not sharply, not formally, but with a quiet acknowledgment that carried its own weight. The officer lowered his hand. His voice when it came was low, controlled, but filled the space effortlessly. "Sir," he said, a single word that redefined everything in the room. Reed felt it land like something solid, something final, the structure he had relied on shifting in an instant. The old man's gaze moved briefly, not searching, not uncertain, just aware, taking in the room, the Marines, the silence that now surrounded him, and then returning to the officer. "You took your time," he said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, only a statement. The officer allowed the faintest hint of acknowledgment to pass across his expression. "We moved as fast as we could," he replied, and the exchange, simple as it was, carried a history no one else in the tent could fully see. Reed stood there, motionless, the weight of the moment settling over him, his earlier words echoing back in a way that felt entirely different now. The question he had asked no longer felt like control. It felt like something he had not understood, something he had not been ready to ask. And in the silence that followed, no one spoke, no one moved, because the answer had already been given, not in rank, not in title, but in the only way that mattered.